I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Charlene. Welcome to Empowered, Life Lessons of Everyday Women.
Each episode, you're going to meet an amazing woman who has struggled through challenges both in her home life and work life and has become very successful. Meet Christina I. You don't have to be perfect. Christina has had over 20 years' experience in a variety of retail roles. She started in retail sales and is now the head of business development. Christina guides us in understanding your strengths and weaknesses to help you become successful. So grab a cup of coffee, get in a comfy chair, and let's talk to Christina. Welcome, Christina. It's nice to have you with us today.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here.
So if you were able to go back and talk to your 20-year-old self and give her some advice, what might that be?
I would love to do that, by the way. I wish that was possible. That would be super cool. I think I would tell my 20-year-old self, you don't have to be perfect to be great.
Very true. But you think so when you're young, right? You think
Sure.
You have to know everything and be everything. How would you define being empowered?
I would say empowerment to me means having control. And not in a negative way, not in a way that is controlling other people, but in a way that you have control over your own life. And you've got the boundaries in place, and you've got the routines in place that you're really focusing on yourself and taking care of yourself. I feel like, what comes to mind is the Maslow hierarchy of needs, right? And I think about that, and I see it as the further you get in that hierarchy, the more empowered you are. And so I would relate those two things together, but ultimately I would say empowerment is about freedom and control over your own life.
I just want to add on to that just a little bit. I know a lot of people in business talk about empowering the people that work for them.
Yes.
How do you see that? Because I think there are some people that think you can empower somebody by just telling them to go do it, and then you shoot them down when they come back to you with everything that you've got, which to me is not being empowered. So how would you define or go about empowering people that work for you?
That's a great question and something I'm super passionate about. I believe that, first of all, in order to empower a team member, you need to understand their strengths. You need to know them. You need to know what their strengths are. You need to know what their opportunities are. And if you are setting them up to, as you started to say, like, go do a project and bring it back, you want to set them up for success. So you want to make sure, one, it's in their wheelhouse. It's something that you believe they're capable of. And if they need support, you partner them up with somebody that can help support them in those ways. But I believe it's really knowing the person and having those conversations about what they're looking to do, what their goals are, and then putting them in a position to be successful with those.
I think that's super important because I think a lot of times you can just sort of hang them out to dry. You say, okay, like you said, go do this project, and they don't even really know where to start, and they're already on the road to failure. So I think that's great. So can you tell me and tell us how you've progressed in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my career in retail. I've been in some version of retail and marketing my entire career, but I sort of fell into retail while I was in college, working for Zales Jewelers was the name of the company. And I started as a sales associate, and I was successful in that role and wanted to keep moving ahead. And within a couple of years, I became a store manager and then a regional manager. And from there, I just sort of progressed, and I always had my eye on the next step. I wanted to master the role I was in, and I found that I could do that pretty quickly. Usually in a year or two, I would say, have some level of mastery of the role that I was in, and I would let it be known that I was interested in moving to the next level. I would stay connected to the people that would be important in those types of decisions. And I would work hard to get the results so that they could see that I had a track record of success.
I think that's great. So you really, not only did you identify what you wanted to do and get the strength to be able to, or the knowledge base to be able to be successful in what you were doing, but letting other people know, letting the people above you and the people that were in the other positions know that you wanted to go there is huge.
Did you write those goals down, or was that just something that you said in your head?
It was more something that I said in my head mentally. I've always been very driven, especially to, continue to progress in my career, to seek that empowerment that we were talking about, that freedom, that control, that independence. That was always something that was very important to me. So I didn't necessarily write the goals down, but once I was in that first role, I made it my mission to continue in that environment, in that space, and that's what I did.
So you had mentioned that you were on an advisory board for women. That sounds really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about that, what that entails?
Yeah, absolutely. So with Cal Poly Pomona, they have a Women in Leadership Group certificate program at their school. And I was involved with really not only taking the curriculum myself and providing feedback along the way, but also just meeting with the group to talk about current topics, holding roundtables, and finding ways to continue to have conversations about the things that maybe others weren't talking about in the workplace. I found that super, super valuable, super empowering, and I learned a lot too.
What type of areas were you covering that weren't covered in the workplace?
Oh, we would talk about things like women asking for raises, women negotiating their pay. Some of those things that in your traditional workplace, those aren't talked about, those aren't encouraged.
They are not at all.
Because it's a don't touch zone, if you will. And so those aren't something you talk about in a workplace, but those are some things you talk about in this type of group. How to set you up for success, what some, best practices are, what some tips are, and things like that in order to be successful when you're in that position.
So can we pick your brain on how do you go about asking for a raise?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say from my perspective, one of the first things is timing. Timing is everything, right? If you are coming off of a bad fiscal year or a bad month, probably not the time to sit down and ask for a raise. So I would say timing is a piece of it. I would also say sit down and keep a track record of your success. What are the things in your existing role that you've done well? What have those things created for the organization, right? And not just the things that are part of your day-to-day job, but how do you reach out to other parts of the organization? How do you impact the culture at an organization? And of course, things like culture are a lot harder to measure, but if you really keep a track record of your wins and your success, you've also got to do your research. You've got to know what your pay is versus the company average and things like that, right? But if you go into the conversation armed with, here's the reason why I'm asking for this, here's where I'm at now, here's where the industry is, here's the last time I got a raise, here's a list of my successes and why I'm positively contributing to the organization. And then again, the timing's got to be right. You've got to have that conversation at the right time.
Right. There's a lot of companies, unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, they have their own set of this is how much we'll get, and they block it out people to 9 block categories, right? The top 2, 3 get certain amounts, and then the bottom people don't get any. It's very hard, in my experience, if you're not in the top, the very, very top, for them to even blink an eye at doing the raise. So, I mean, it's great advice.
I think sometimes what happens is if you're the head of a department, you get a certain budget for that, and you have to figure out how to dole all those out. And maybe everybody in your department's really been working well and been working up. It's a very difficult decision. I think we don't necessarily, as workers, reflect so much on what the challenge is for the manager or the head of that department when they're going through to try to evaluate the work that you've been doing as well.
So it's hard. It's hard.
And I've been on both sides of that coin, of course. And absolutely, right? You've got budget to work with and you've got certain things, guidelines in place. But I've also found that your manager is the one that owns that bucket, right? So you've got to make sure that you're very visible to them and that you're having conversations with them about your success. And I think for women, whether it's negotiating pay or asking for a raise, the advice I would give is don't say no to yourself.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
You've got to ask the question. If they say no, they say no. but you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Absolutely. Well, I know one of the pieces of advice I've given to other people is you should do a summary of the things that you've done for either that week or that month or whatever, and send your manager an email. Just say, hey, just want to keep you informed. These are the things that I've been doing this month. Do you have any questions? What have you? So that it's front and center in their mind, because not only does it show what you've been able to accomplish for that period of time, but it also may give them a clue on what they might want to give you to do later.
Absolutely. You're putting yourself in a position to be noticed.
So you're currently the head of business development.
Yes.
Sounds pretty fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've spent the last decade or so in field marketing, working for agencies where I really ran the operations of programs for Fortune 500 clients. And the role I'm in now, I switched over to at the beginning of this year. And what's really exciting about it is now I get to sell in these types of programs to the Fortune 500 companies. So I think it's important when you're selling anything to really have a lot of experience with the product, be knowledgeable about the product. And since I spent time on the operations side running these programs, I intimately know what brands are looking for, what consumers are looking for. And so it's really put me in a position to be able to have the conversation with a brand of what their needs are and then be able to match a solution for those needs.
So turning to another topic, I know that you travel quite a bit and you also have a child.
Yes.
How do you balance all that? Because work balance is definitely a topic that comes up to our listeners many, many times.
Oh, yes. And that's another topic we cover in the Women in Leadership group, because it's not as often talked about in the workplace, right? For me, I would say even when I was pregnant, I traveled a lot. And so my son was, in my belly with me on work trips while I was standing on stage speaking to audiences. And so that culture started very early with him, even when I was pregnant. And then when he was, 1-2 years old, he would travel with me where it made sense, right? It doesn't always make sense. You've got work to prioritize. You're there for work. But where it could work, I would bring my son along with me, as well as my husband. And I think one of the things that has helped me so much personally is finding that right partner that wants to support and complement what you're doing and work as a team versus competing against you.
Mm-hmm.
And that has been ultimately so critical to my success. There was a time where he was a stay-at-home dad with my son so that I could work and I could travel. There are times where he traveled with me and my son. He's back at work again, but it's that balance and that teamwork that really made it possible for me to do that.
And you're very fortunate. That's wonderful.
I agree. I'm very lucky.
So you were pregnant while you were working. So this is kind of a multi-part. We've had a couple people ask me this question. When did you know it was the right time to tell your boss that you were pregnant?
I love this question, by the way. So we were with one of our favorite clients. I was with my boss and his boss, and we were with one of our favorite clients, and we were on a work trip in Salt Lake City. And we were out for dinner. We went to see Alice in Chains concert, and I wasn't drinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I had just that week taken the test. I hadn't even been to the doctor yet. So it was super early. My husband knew, but I didn't know how or when to tell my work colleagues, right? And so I said to my husband, well, how do I handle this? Like, I'm going into this meeting. We would normally be drinking and celebrating together, enjoying the night. And so he said, well, we'll tell them we're doing Sober October. It was October at the time. And so I said Sober October, and I thought, we'll see how this goes over. Them shortly after I went to the doctor and had my first appointment, I told them, and they said, well, we already knew that. As soon as you said Sober October, we knew something was going on. And, we were talking about it behind your back when you were in the bathroom. So they weren't as surprised as I thought they would be. But yeah, it's awkward. It's definitely awkward. And I would say there's also this part where there's an assumption that maybe you won't return. Right. And so I was very eager to return to work after 70% of my maternity leave was up, I was itching. I was like creating spreadsheets about feeding patterns because I was just so like I needed that stimulation. And so I was very anxious to get back to work, but I remember them wondering if I would return.
So, Christina, I was exactly the same way. First of all, I don't think in my life I ever saw myself having children, but then I had a child. So the first one with 3 months, I was literally, as you said, clawing to get back to work. I just missed work. I missed the work environment. With the second one, I kind of figured out that it was okay to have some free time, but I'd never had free time. I'd worked since I was like 14 and a half years old. So that was a very strange kind of transition. Work was kind of my comfort place.
Yeah, I understand that. So one of the questions that came up, so you mentioned Sober October. One of the women that I've recently met, she is pregnant. She has a lot of social things with work that require drinking. Did you find anything that because you weren't drinking, did people look at you differently? Was there any, I guess, issues from that perspective?
No issues from that perspective, but at least in the space I'm in, it's part of the culture. It's part of how you do business. It's part of how you entertain clients. And so it was different. I think once people knew I was pregnant, it wasn't as awkward, but up until that time where not everyone knew I was pregnant, I would order a club soda or do something like that, but I would try to not draw attention to it, if that makes sense.
So this is my little soapbox, I guess, but there was so much centered around alcohol, and for people who either can't drink or don't want to drink, it can be very uncomfortable for them because so much of it is centered around drinking and having fun. And I would love to be a culture where it's okay not to.
Yeah.
It's okay not to have to hide it that you're not drinking.
Agreed.
So how do you re-energize yourself so you can be really effective at your job and at home?
Well, I think for me, I know that I require a certain amount of downtime. That's how I recharge. I'm naturally an introvert, so after a lot of meetings and social interaction, I'm burnt out. Like I want time alone. I want to be by myself, listen to a book, listen to music, be in the quiet. I really need that to recharge, so I know that about myself. I think it's important as a mom to put your mask on first. And I think earlier when my son was younger, that was harder for me to do because I felt this need or this obligation or this guilt if it wasn't all centered around him. And eventually I got to a place, I'm not sure when or how, but I got to a place where I knew that I need to make sure that my mask is on first so that then I can be there for him. And we'll all be happier because of it.
One of the philosophies that my husband and I both said, and we saw this differently in other relationships and other people that had children. But for us, we said this child, it came into our life. We didn't come into theirs. And so we
I love that.
Kept that really close to our heart about he's joining us. We're not changing necessarily what we're doing in our life. And it really worked well for us. I saw where other families, the child became the center of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that was good for anybody.
No.
Looking at those relationships now.
Well, it reminds me when we interviewed Nella. Nella had just had a baby, and she said, I didn't stop hiking. The baby went with us. I mean, from the time he was really little. And I think that makes sense because you can't lose your identity just because you have a new identity. You can't lose the old one.
Absolutely.
Is there any aspect of your life, of your career, that you'd like to have a do-over with?
Ooh, good question. I would say no. And I would say no because if things played out differently, I wouldn't be where I am today. I wouldn't have had the experiences that I've had today. Were there some hard times along the way? Absolutely. Looking back, I would remind myself in those moments, this too shall pass. But I feel like I've always had a natural intuition to know when a place was no longer right for me, whether that was a workplace, whether that was a relationship, whether that was a city I was living in. And so I've been able to just know that this is not for me and be able to remove myself from that environment and put myself in a position to be in an environment that I thought was a better fit.
We've talked about intuition. I call it going with your gut, but there have been multiple conversations about this. And it seems like, and especially if to our listeners, I mean, you really need to listen to that little inner voice. It's guiding you. It's when you don't listen to it that you get into problems.
Do you have any advice that you would give to people who are dealing with conflicts and time and constraints at work?
And I think for me, this question isn't just about work, it's about your life, right? Because people feel like they don't have enough time, regardless, right? And so that they're trying to take a full day and figure out, well, what are the times in here that I'm working? What are the times in here that I'm not working? And one exercise that really helped me was making a list of, like on an Excel sheet, right? Like, how are you actually spending your time in a day? If doing that for a week, you'll find lots of little pockets in there of, oh, I could repurpose this time. Do I really want to be scrolling on TikTok for an hour and a half? Do I really want to be doing XYZ? Like, you will find those pockets if you really look at how you're spending your time. But in terms of the workday, I think it's just about prioritization of what your to-dos are. And if you have a North Star or a mission statement that you're working towards, if there's something that doesn't fit into that, you say no to it or you deprioritize it. I think that's super important, is knowing what really will make an impact and what you should invest your time in versus what's noise.
I like that a lot. I really like that a lot.
So, Christina, what do you think has been your biggest life lesson? And do you have any additional advice that you would like to share with our listeners?
I think my biggest life lesson is to prioritize and value the connections in your life, whether they're connections from high school, family, extended family, new friends. I love the Bronnie Ware 5 Regrets of the Dying. And in that, she talks about, I wish I worked less. I wish I stayed in touch with some of my friends. Things like that. And there's a lot of themes in there around connection. And so I think it's important to prioritize and value those connections and make time to make those last. I've been removed from my family geographically since I was basically an adult. Now I live on the West Coast, and my family's in Pennsylvania on the East Coast. My husband's family's in Washington State, and we're living in California. So we prioritize and make sure that we're taking regular trips to see them and spend time with them, because I think those connections are the thing that helps keep you grounded and the thing that you'll regret if you don't do later in life.
I can totally relate because I'm on the West Coast. My whole family's on the East Coast. And when I was working, that was how I spent my vacations. I'd get my kids and go back to visit family because I wanted, not only for me, but I wanted them to know the family.
Yeah, absolutely.
Huge.
So one of the benefits that people don't talk about of social media, because it's a lot of negativity, but for me personally, I have reconnected with so many people that have touched my lives. And so when people say, oh, I'm off Facebook or I'm off, I'm just not there anymore, I said, it has brought so much joy to me to find out what has happened to people that I valued that maybe I did lose touch with, and now I've reconnected.
Right.
So I find that extremely helpful. And, however you do it, it is a joy to have that connection. I have connection with family in Europe that really is like generationally away, but both of us have worked hard to keep that connection together. I think it's really important.
Well, and I think social media has helped to keep the connections going because the younger kids or adults, right? They're used to staying connected that way. There's a lot of drawbacks, right? But they've kept those connections. And I don't think everybody has 1,000 friends, but you know who those 100 are that are close.
Yeah. And there's ways to obviously effectively not have some relationships with others. That's your choice.
Of course.
That's right. That's
so
right.
Any additional advice you'd like to share with our listeners before we end this interview?
I would say thanks for listening and be brave. Be confident in yourself and go for what you want. Ask yourself, what do you want, and go for it.
I like that.
Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Christina. Really appreciated it.
Thank you.
To our listeners,
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Empowered Life Lessons of Everyday Women. We would really appreciate if you could leave us a rating or a review. If you have any challenges or questions you are facing, we want to hear from you as we value your input and suggestions. And if you have a compelling story or life lesson you would like to share, please connect with us at empoweredlifelessons@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, other social media platforms, or visit us at empoweredlifelessons.com. In our next episode, meet Sarah T. Sarah has been involved with healthcare for over 20 years. She saw firsthand the impact of provider burnout and wanted to find a way to make a difference.